Good evening. Again, it's a rainy, wet evening. It always is on Victoria Day, the long weekend, the first long weekend of summer. It's two things are guaranteed. It's going to rain and the price of gas will go up for the weekend. Uh, but like death and taxes, it's quite predictable. I had a note from a Protestant minister who sometimes writes about broadcasts. And he suggested to me that maybe part of the problem with some of the people who are quite vicious and vindictive about transgendered people is that in their ignorance they mistake transgender for cross-dressing or drag queens, that sort of thing. But actually, statistics will show us that more heterosexual men do cross-dressing than gay men, because generally speaking, um, gay men aren't interested in being women at all. Um, I want to touch on this transgender again because it's one of the things that the ultra-right are the most evil and savage and vindictive about. And why do I use the term evil? Because these people would like to trap innocent victims in an untenable condition that can result in a great deal of misery and suffering for all of their lives. And they want to do it because of their own, and I think, premeditated ignorance, that first of all, associating transgender with homosexuality is extremely ignorant. And I use the word advisedly. It's ignorant. I can't think of another word to describe it. Anybody who cared about other human beings would have long ago learned the difference. Anybody who had any kind of compassion or sympathy for humanity or for human beings would have learned the difference long ago. So it could only be a kind of cruel vindictiveness that prevents people from knowing once they take an interest in the subject. And I'm going to say once more that, we can look at all of the scientific evidence. We can look at all of the trisomies and all of the epigenetics and all these other things. But people who are addicted to evil thought and to maliciousness will never be able to change this affliction that they suffer from. But at the same time, there's no reason why normal civilized human beings should go along with their predispositions. Transgendered people have a brain which is a totally different gender than their bodies. Sometimes this shows up physically as well. Often it doesn't, except in certain aspects of behavior. Now, we've mentioned before that very often, about 30,000 births a year in Canada, one in 3,000, I think, in the United States, children who are born with no definite physical gender, and they've been regendered by their doctors, sometimes wrong, in the wrong direction. And then somebody will come along and say, well, they should be satisfied with the gender that God gave them because of their genitalia. The doctor gave them the gender. God didn't. And some trisomy of some kind gave them the gender, had nothing to do with God at all. The gender that God gave them is the gender of their brain. The body is subject to so many things that take place in the fetal stage. So many genetic things, so many epigenetic things, so many chemical things from various chemical things in the atmosphere, or mothers who smoke or drink or do drugs while they're pregnant. All kinds of problems arise. Birth not cut and dried. Fetuses are not just some object that passes through like something going before a camera or a tin of soup on an assembly belt, where the same soup goes in every tin and the same lid is slammed on and soldered. uh, so there are so many things wrong with its essentialist way of thinking. And practically everything is wrong with ultra right wing or the religious right and their way of thinking. It's the greatest savagery on the face of the earth. Whether it's Christian, Islamic, Hindu, or whatever, it's simply savagery. Now, there's as we say, so many things can go wrong. In early times, and some of the Holy Fathers as well, really had the idea that the male sperm was the entire child. In fact, I'll have to try to think of his name or remember it, one Dutchman who came with the earliest microscopes, put sperm on the slide and expected to see an extremely miniature human being in the sperm, because the thought was still that a woman was simply an incubator for a man's sperm, that the whole child was contained in the sperm. It was implanted in the woman's womb where it incubated, and then she nourished it. They didn't know really about eggs. Females, pine trees, Japanese beetles, ostriches, they all lay eggs. Human beings also lay eggs, just like every other creature on Earth, including, by the way, most plants. Most plants, the male has to contend to try to be the one who fertilizes the female. It's just like in the animal kingdom, only it's done a little differently. We'll talk about that a little later. But in any case, females lay eggs. The only role the male plays is to fertilize the eggs, and he does so with an incomplete cell, one without a proper membrane. In some species, the male is a nondescript little tiny thing that sometimes is permanently attached to the female, and his only function in life is to fertilize female eggs. Female is the default gender in all species. And this is something that we got to come to grips with, because there is a prayer. Fortunately, we find out now it wasn't of Orthodox origin, like so many of the prayers that have crept into the church, like the prayer for the departure of the soul and all. This came from Italy as late as the 1300s. And it actually blames the woman for homicide if she has a miscarriage. Because, of course, the child is the man's child. And people will still see that. You'll even hear a woman saying, I'm going to have his child. That comes down to us from the time when people thought that the woman was merely an incubator and that the sperm was the entire child. So then you can blame the woman and say, oh, she's guilty of murdering the man's child if she has an accidental miscarriage. That's one of the most hideous, revolting prayers, revolting ideas that have ever infiltrated the church from the Latin West. And I want to also make a comment on a comment that was made on the last broadcast. Somebody brought up this American organization, NAMBLA, which advocates, of course, pedophilia. Pedophilia is an unusual thing. Of course, as we learned in the last decade or two, the Roman Catholic Church is the original NAMBLA, the original facilitator of sexual abuse of children, especially sexual abuse of young boys. But there was sexual abuse of girls and women also in the Roman Catholic Church. Now, what resonates with us about that is the fact that the Vatican seeks to be the final arbiter of everything sexual on the face of the earth. But it is the original NAMBLA. It is the original facilitator for centuries, the facilitator of the sexual abuse of children. And not just a facilitator, but covering it up. Probably the Roman Catholic Church should have been prosecuted under the RICO Act in America for facilitating and then aiding and abetting and covering up for a major crime, a felony, repeatedly, and for a century at least in America. So let's first of all get some people off their high horse and their artificial high ground, which is really a mound of sand waiting for a rainstorm, and bring it down to earth a little bit. Sexual abuse of boys, 80% of the time it's a heterosexual near relative. In the Arab world, it's probably 99% of the time, particularly in Afghanistan, where it's perfectly acceptable. Well, it's actually acceptable throughout the Islamic world, so long as there's violence involved and there's no love involved. It's fine. It's acceptable, even though uh, there's a vocal condemnation of it. It's perfectly acceptable in actual society itself. So there are a lot of things and admixtures that are going on that need to be looked at in a more honest and sincere way. But really, that concerns me a little bit less here than this persecution and attempted destruction of humanity in dealing with transgendered people. Because this is very clearly a valid clinical situation which can be rectified in medicine. And it requires a surgery, of course. But in the case of a transgendered person, the gender that God gave the person is the gender of the brain. The brain is where all self-identity, where all the movements of the body take place. So the brain is the God-given gender. The body is not necessarily the God-given gender. The body can often be an accident of genetics, of chromosomes, of chemical interventions, and all kinds of things. The brain is the gender. In a transgendered person, the brain is the gender they actually are. The body is not the gender they actually are. And this conflict, this tormenting conflict that creates enormous suffering, can be rectified through medical intervention. To deny that that should be done is simply evil. And I don't know of any other word for it except evil. To want to force people to endure this incredible suffering through no fault of their own, and then try to blame God, as the ultra-right does. God causes earthquakes, God causes tornadoes, God causes tens of millions of innocent people to die every year just to get even with one person or something like that. Anyway, this is why I'm talking about evil and malice and all of those other things, that people take that attitude and that they remain willfully, premeditatedly ignorant about it and still try to persecute the people. If there was 1 ounce of compassion, of any sense of humanity, of compassion for human beings, for mankind, nobody would remain in that kind of ignorance and persecute these people in that way. No one who has complete sanity, no one who's not doesn't have a streak of genuine evil within them would ever try to do that to any other human being. And that's really the issue that troubles me the most. So I just want to pass that on. And again, if somebody can have a decent civilized discussion about it, I'll be happy to engage it. If somebody's going to spew out venom and vitriol against these people and condemn and accuse them, uh, not even trying to find out what the reality is, then don't bother me. Put it on your own blog, put it on your own website, try to stir up other people to hatred and malice, to join you in your hatred and malice in which you've boiled your soul already. Fine, but I don't want to hear about it. If you want to have a decent conversation, even a debate about it, fine, as long as you can do it in a decent, civilized manner. Thank you and God bless you.